While he was in Minobu, the persecutions against his followers continued. They gave up persecuting Nichiren because they'd proved that they couldn't do what they wanted to with him, which was to kill him. But they then, sadly for Nichiren Daishonin, turned on his followers. And this culminated in a persecution called the Atsuhara persecution, where peasants in a particular area of Japan who had followed Nichiren Daishonin's teachings for not more than about 3 years were attacked by the government, and ultimately, because they refused to give up their faith, 3 of these simple farmers were beheaded. So this, of course, not only was a great sadness to Nichiren Daishonin, but also to him was evidence of the incredible faith of his followers. He knew from that time that his followers would protect his teachings through anything, and above all that they would protect the Gohonzon. So he then inscribed the Daigohonzon, which due to that spirit of protection and faith is still in existence today at the head temple. Later, in 1282, he knew that he was coming to the end of his life, and he then handed over what are known as the treasures. That's the Daigohonzon and some of his original writings and various other treasures to his closest disciple, who was a man called Nikko. And Nikko became the first high priest of Nichiren Shoshu, or the Nichiren, the orthodox sect of Nichiren Buddhism. So that is his life, and during the course of it I've mentioned quite a bit about the connection of Nichiren Daishonin's actions with the teachings of Shakyamuni 2,000 years before. So what had this amazing man, who led an incredible life, really achieved? In no way had he tried to make himself a superman or a man with supreme power. In all his teachings, he'd emphasized that we can develop the same qualities, the same courage, the same wisdom, the same compassion, the same, if you like, dynamism in our own lives, if we would follow the simple practice of reciting the sutra, chanting Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and teaching others and study the 3 practices of Buddhism. He also taught that we could achieve the same oneness with the forces of the universe as he actually exemplified at the incident of Tatsunokuchi. And above all, that we could achieve the same oneness with ourselves, which is perhaps the most important thing of all. So instead of, as it were, knocking Shakyamuni, in fact, he was the triumph arising from Shakyamuni's teachings. In the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni, in fact, taught the Gohonzon, but it was in words and descriptive language which no one had been able to understand until Nichiren Daishonin appeared. In the ceremony of the air of the Lotus Sutra, Shakyamuni Buddha actually describes the Gohonzon. And the Gohonzon of Nichiren Daishonin, which we have in our houses, is an exact depiction or picture of the ceremony of the air. And of course at the heart of it is Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which was actually the title of the sutra itself. It wasn't until Nichiren Daishonin came that anyone could understand it, let alone teach it to others. Shakyamuni himself had said that. No one will understand this sutra in this age, but in the age of Mappo it'll be the only teaching which can bring happiness to mankind. So, in other words, Nichiren Daishonin, exactly as the Buddha Shakyamuni had predicted, brought to life the Lotus Sutra, and then embodied it, which was also his enlightenment, in the form of the Gohonzon. So in that sense, as the high priest said not long ago, Shakyamuni Buddha taught the Lotus Sutra specifically for Nichiren Daishonin. He predicted the appearance of the Buddha of the age of Mappo, and he taught the Lotus Sutra specifically for that Buddha, so that that Buddha could give proof of the orthodox flow of Buddhism down through the ages. This was Shakyamuni's essential purpose before he died, just the same as Nichiren Daishonin's essential purpose was to inscribe the Gohonzon, which could be passed on down through the ages, and as he put it, on into eternity. So why is it that there are still so many other sects of Buddhism? The first reason is that those sects grew from people who did not hear the Lotus Sutra. In other words, Shakyamuni taught for 42 years, and only very few of his disciples stayed with him for that full period. Others moved off in various directions down into southern India and Southeast Asia. And they never heard of the Lotus Sutra. And since there was no telly and no newspapers, and no books and no mail or post, they never did hear about it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So of course, gradually, no doubt through reading books in this age, people know there is a thing called the Lotus Sutra, though they may be practicing a Hinayana or a provisional Mahayana teaching, but they don't know what it is or what its significance is. This was the first reason. And the second reason is that even those who did find the Lotus Sutra simply couldn't understand it. So the Lotus Sutra was used extensively at one time in a theoretical way, but the heart of it, in other words, the practice of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, was never discovered. And there's nothing surprising in this, because Shakyamuni Buddha said this is the teaching for the age of Mappo, and that only in the age of Mappo would people have expanded their intellect sufficiently to be able to understand the teaching of the true teaching of the Lotus Sutra. After Nichiren Daishonin died, moving on to the last part of this lecture, which brings it up to the present day, Nikko Shonin, as I said, took over. And he immediately faced opposition. He was one of 6 elder priests who'd been appointed by Nichiren Daishonin to look after the main base in Mount Manobu. And after Nichiren Daishonin died, 5 of these elder priests left, went taiten, as we call it today. There were various reasons for this. The first one was that they very much feared persecution. This was probably one of the main reasons. In the shelter of the great man, they had courage. But once the great man died, they couldn't take the thought of the persecution that might follow. And secondly, they really didn't understand Nichiren Daishonin's teachings. One may say, well, how can that be? But it can be so. If someone, as it were, lives in the shadow of someone else, then it's almost like hero worship. Nikko was very different, because Nikko didn't live in his shadow. He was always off in different directions, spreading the teachings and standing alone. Also, Nikko had shared Nichiren Daishonin's persecutions on Sado Island and at Izu, and really understood his master and the depths of his teachings. But those other priests didn't. So these 5 elder priests are important because it was from them that 2 or 3 other Nichiren sects, which exist to this day, were founded. These Nichiren sects do not understand the Gohonzon. They do sometimes chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, but they neither understand the Gohonzon nor the fact that Nichiren Daishonin was the Buddha of the age of Mappo. And therefore, their practice has little effect. So sometimes you may hear of a Nichiren sect, but the only sect which carried on the orthodox teachings and the Daigohonzon was Nichiren Shoshu, the orthodox sect of Nichiren Buddhism. In 1289, Nikkei Shonin went in accordance with Nichiren Daishonin's will and testament to the foothills of Mount Fuji in order to find a final sanctuary for the Daigo Honzon. In a gosho called The Three Great Secret Laws, Nichiren Daishonin talks of the place where the sanctuary should be. And he took with him, of course, the followers who were supporting him, plus the treasures, that is to say, the original writings of Nichiren Daishonin, many of which exist to this day at the head temple. He also took Nichiren Daishonin's ashes, and he was incredibly sad that he wasn't able to take with him those other elder priests. There's a quotation that I might just read you there, if I can find it. Nikkei Shonin wrote, "Upon leaving the valleys of Minobu, I cannot express with words my deepest shame and regret. I have reconfirmed, however, that it is essential that wherever I might be, I should inherit and propagate the Daishonin's teachings in this world. I have been truly worried about leaving here, yet all the disciples have now gone against the Master. I, Nikko, believe I alone will maintain the righteousness of the Master and fulfill the supreme objective so that I shall not forget his original intention." The supreme objective being, of course, to protect the Daigo Honzon and to further the movement for world peace, or as we call it, Kosen-Rufu. Now, when he got to the foot of Mount Fuji, Nanjo Tokimitsu, who was the lord of the local manor in one area near Mount Fuji, offered land to Nikko to start the head temple. And the first building was actually constructed in 1290. Of course, like all wooden buildings, or most wooden buildings, it's been burnt down since. And over the course of hundreds of years, the present-day head temple has gradually appeared. So the land covered some hundreds of acres. Much of that was confiscated by the military government during the last World War II. But still, the head temple does own a great deal of land, and the buildings are extensive, as many of you may have heard or seen in pictures. So Nikkei Shonin was the first high priest of an unbroken line of high priests down to today, with the 67th high priest, Nikken Shonin. And each of those high priests has succeeded to the will and testament of Nichiren Daishonin, in particular to the right to inscribe gohonzons, which is the right solely of the high priest of Nichiren Shoshu. And the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin have been passed in their purity from high priest to high priest, as it's put in the terminology of Nichiren Shoshu, without spilling a single drop of the pure water of true Buddhism. So in 1972, so long after Nichiren Daishonin's death, the final sanctuary for the Daigo Honzon was constructed. By that time, the people, the followers, had the power, both financially, to build such a building, and also to be able to protect it with their faith. And the opening of that took place on October the 12th, 1972. So it's important to understand that during that period of several hundred years, from 1282, when Nichiren Daishonin died, to World War II and its end in 1945, Nichiren Shoshu had continued to be under almost constant persecution. And wherever you go in Japan today, or most places you go, you will find there is a history there, in whatever place or city or provincial town, of some sort of persecution of Nichiren Shoshu followers. And this was, of course, because the government continued to follow the teachings of other sects and subsequently reverted to the original inherent early religion of Shinto. So at no time during that period were Nichiren Shoshu able or permitted to propagate the teachings. Of course, at various times they were joined by other religions so far as that ban was concerned, depending on whether those religions were in favor with the government or not. But Nichiren Shoshu, all through that period, had to struggle against persecution of one sort or another. Finally, Finally, in the Meiji Restoration, which was the time when Japan opened its doors once again, and when the Industrial Revolution of Japan began, some relaxation in the restrictions on the freedom of religion were granted by the government. It wasn't full relaxation, but a certain amount. And a certain amount of propagation began, with the result that by 1930 there were some thousands of followers, and in 1930 itself, Mr. Makiguchi, who became the first president of the Soka Gakkai, formed what he called the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai. That was the education society for the creation of value through education. So Mr. Makiguchi's original intentions were entirely to do with education. He was an educator. But gradually his belief and understanding of the all-embracing teachings of Nichiren Daishonin became stronger and stronger in his life, until in the end the educational aspect of the Soka Gakkai took a back step and the religious aspect came to the forefront. So this comparatively small lay society, probably around about 3,000 or so members, was in existence in Japan during those early 1930s. And then, amazingly enough, persecution began once again. This, of course, was with the rise to power of the military authorities in Japan, which led to the Chino-Japanese War and to the war in Manchuria, and ultimately to them joining in World War II with the great incident at Pearl Harbor. Before the war began, Nichiren Shoshu and its lay society, the Soka Kyoiku Gakkai, were already under suspicion. And after the war began, their activities began to be restricted. They were not permitted to publish a paper, and then the leaders were watched and followed. And then an incident arose where the government of the day demanded that every religion in Japan should adopt certain tenets or principles of the Shinto religion. The reason for this was that they wanted to make the emperor once more clearly established as a god, which the Japanese people would worship, and of course this would, at the center of this, would be supreme nationalism and militarism. So Nichiren Shoshu refused to accept this edict. And in this incident, the lay leaders took a very important part. In fact, it was Mr. Makiguchi more than anybody else who said we must never give in, and that we'll do our best to protect and support the priests in this difficult times. So ultimately, in 1942, as a result of his stand, Mr. Makiguchi was arrested together with Mr. Toda, who was his chief aide and follower, and who eventually became the second president of the Soka Gakkai, and 21 other leaders. And all the other followers were really driven underground. So this was the situation until the end of the war in 1945, when the American forces under MacArthur landed in Japan and took over rule of the country until such time as a new constitution was devised. And of course the new constitution contained the important clause that religion and the right of man to worship as he pleases should be inherent, an inherent right of all Japanese people. And for the first time ever, it was possible to propagate or teach Nam-myoho Renge Kyo freely anywhere in the country. Now, Mr. Makiguchi died in prison, as most of you know. Mr. Toda came out, and his passion, his burning passion, was never to allow these great teachings to fall into darkness again. And he determined that he would expand the lay membership to more than 750,000 families before he died. That time he was sick and ill, having been in prison under extreme conditions for several years. But his passion drove him on, and by the time he died in 1957, there were in fact about 800,000 families practicing in Japan. And this was the foundation, these 800,000 families, of course, for the worldwide movement that exists today. So gradually, Nichiren Shoshu and the Gohonzon spread overseas. This happened round about 20 years ago. Extraordinarily enough, and with no designed plan, members went with the Gohonzon to the United States and to South America and to Europe for no planned reason but to go into business or expand their lives personally in some way or another. And through that, around those original Gohonzons, so the movement in each country has grown, quite naturally. So this, I hope, has given you an idea, anyway, of the flow of Buddhism down through the ages to the Gohonzon that we have in our houses today, and to the Nam-myoho Renge Kyo that you chant, I hope, often in the peace of your own rooms. It's been a very turbulent history. But if you relate that to one's own experience of Sanchashima, as we call it, the fact that when we try to advance our lives, some force, which of course is the negative or destructive force of life, tries to stop us. We see this clearly in our own individual lives. Multiply that by many, and one can understand the reason for the persecution and obstacles and difficulties which the teachings of Nichiren Daishonin have encountered from their very earliest days. So thank you very much for listening. If anyone wants to ask questions, we could probably manage 5 minutes or so. Yes? No, that's a bit exaggerated, actually. In the early days of spreading the teachings of the Gohonzon in America, Gohonzons were given much too easily. As you may know, in this country and in all countries of the world nowadays, Gohonzons are not given easily. It's the desire of everyone to make sure that someone really wants to practice and really feels the depths of their lives, the importance of the practice before they receive the Gohonzon. But in those days in America, you'd only got to pop your head inside a meeting room and someone was putting a Gohonzon in your hands. So as a result of that, a great many Gohonzons were given, probably as many as 200,000. But the membership, the active membership at the moment in America, is probably now around about 50 to 60,000. And when President Ikeda was there in October last year, he said to the American members, please in this coming year, let's get back to about 100,000 active members. That is to say, not only people who are newly starting to practice, but many of those who stopped practicing even though they had the Gohonzon because they didn't really understand what they were doing. So study was much lacking. But through their experience and the mistakes that were made then, I think we've learned a lot today. So in a way, they were the sort of guinea pigs so far as the overseas movement was concerned. And they've had a struggle because of that. But now I think they're coming back really high again. There's a great surge forward going on in America. Okay. Yes. I don't believe so. But that may sound such an arrogant thing to say. But Shakyamuni said, the only teaching for this age is the Lotus Sutra. So although I'm sure there are plenty of people who have obtained partial enlightenment, I don't believe it's possible, no. I mean, Shakyamuni was extremely clear on this point, but not everyone can understand that, or if they do know of it, they don't quite want to listen to it, I think. Yes, John? Why do we do Gongyo in Japanese? Well, we got to do it in some language, and of course Nichiren Daishonin was born in Japan. So I dare say if we were reciting the sutra in English, which I might say would take a long, long time, because Chinese characters are the most economical in the world, if we were reciting in English, I'm sure the Japanese and the Brazilians will be saying, why can't we do Gongyo in Brazilian, or why can't we do it in something else? So, of course, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is universal. So it must be, we must be able to meet together as we do at any time, anywhere, and all of us, whatever part of the world, whatever race or color, or whatever we are, can get together immediately and in wonderful rhythm, vigorously do Gongyo together. The bell is, as it's been put by one of the high priests, the shallow reason for ringing a bell is control. That is to say, when you're doing Gongyo together, you can control that practice through the ringing of the bell. But the deep reason for ringing the bell is that, as it's put in the old terms, it pleases the Buddhist gods. That is to say, the sound of the bell is extremely harmonious and pleasing to the forces that exist in your own life and in the universe around you. You have to think about that. Certainly, speaking for myself, there have been times when I've been rather jangled and perhaps irritable when I started to do Gongyo, and the sound of that bell, which really vibrates deep in one's life, has a very deep effect. Music for the forces of the universe. Okay? Yes. Yes, he died in 1282 in the house of one of his followers, whose family name was Munenaga, I think it is. That was one of the two brothers in a gosho called the Letter to the Brothers. Munenaka, I think. Wait a minute, I've got it written down somewhere. I can't remember which one it was. Yes, Munenaka Ikegami. Sorry, Ikegami was the family name. Munenaka was his first name. And he was one of the brothers in that famous gosho Letter to the Brothers. And before ever he arrived there, he'd already made his will and testament. There are two, actually, extant will and testaments at the head temple, in which the Nichiren Daishonin formally appoints Nikko Shonin as his successor and gives him the task of guarding the treasures and the purity of the teachings. So those two documents are still, as I say, at the head temple. Was there anything particular in that you... No, he had not been well for about 2 or 3 years, and in one or two writings he said that he was suffering from what he described as diarrhea. And of course he'd been under considerable privation during those years on Sado Island, and indeed Manobu itself was a very remote place. But in all other respects he died a natural death. He was 61 years old, which doesn't seem very old today, but was a good age for those days. And not only in Japan, but also in this country as well. The average expectancy of life was about 55 to 60 years. And yes, he died a natural death. No, he was teaching, actually, on the day that he died. He was still teaching. I'm trying to think where that is recorded, in Nikoshonin's writing. He gave a lecture on some particular aspect of the teachings during that day, and then died in the evening. I might be able to give you a bit more about that. Just don't mind waiting a sec. Somewhere here. I have to find it. Here we are. Yes, in September 1282, he died in November. In September 1282, he made the first, what they call the transfer document. I, Nichiren, will transfer all of the teachings I have propagated throughout my life to Byakuren Ajari Nikko, who should be the great leader for propagating true Buddhism. And then he talks about when the sovereign accepts the law, the high sanctuary of Honmonji temple of the true Buddhism should be erected at the foot of Mount Fuji. Simply wait for the proper time to come. This is the actual high sanctuary of true Buddhism. Above all, my disciples should observe this document. That was in September, and then on the 13th of October, there was another transfer document, which is shorter. I will transfer Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings of 50 years to Byakuren Ajari Nikko, who should become the chief priest of Minobu Kuonji Temple. Those priests and lay believers who disregard this will be slanderers of the law. And that was dated the 13th day of October. Sorry, did I say so in November? October, sorry. October he died. Okay. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? Certainly not excluded from teaching, because both in the Gosho and in actuality, of course, women teach everywhere in the world, in the lay society. And Nichiren Daishonin talks at one place about the absolute equality of men and women, and how we should respect whoever is teaching the law, whether man or woman. There have never been any woman priests. Certainly Nichiren Daishonin never said that there shouldn't be, but there never has been. But of course one must remember in that respect that Nichiren Shoshu grew in Japan, where, speaking generally, I don't think there have been any woman priests except in one or two sort of cults or sects. But that's not to say, I suppose, that maybe one day there will be. Absolutely none. No. Yes. Right. Yes, but I mean, but that's... Does it describe her as a nun? I don't know. I've never thought of that. You're quite right. I think in the Gosho it does describe him as a nun, her as a nun. But anyway, there have never been any monks or nuns in Nichiren Shoshu. There's just the priesthood and the lay society. I tell you what she may have been, though. I mean, maybe she helped in some way at a temple or at the head temple. That is to say, she assisted the priests in some particular way. I don't know. But that, I'm afraid I can't answer. But I'll try and find out for you, Hilary, and let you know. I know the Gosho you mean. Yes. Anything else? Yes. That'll be the last one, hadn't it? Sorry, I couldn't quite hear. Let me answer this as best I can. Fundamentally, the purpose of this practice is to change those devilish, negative and destructive aspects of human life which cause war and other evils. So therefore, the prime purpose of the movement of Nichiren Shoshu is to encourage people to do that, as we call it, human revolution. And therefore, one of the three practices is to spread the teachings to others so that they too can carry out that human revolution and eliminate those aspects of human nature which cause war and pollution and all the rest of it. So that is the prime purpose. But when you say, are there any other activities? Yes, for example, in Japan, they've made great efforts recently to hold exhibitions concerning the horror of war, and they've published many volumes, some of which are now in English, of experiences, actual experiences of people of the horrors of war. A book called Cries for Peace, and which is in many volumes in the Japanese language, and there's already one volume out in English and another one out very soon. I would say, really, in a sense, all activities of Nichiren Shoshu members is concerning peace. Even if one goes to a small discussion meeting, in some way or another, one can tell this is spreading the teachings which can lead to a peaceful and harmonious world. But if you're saying, do we march in peace marches and that sort of thing, the answer to that is no. Because unfortunately, all such things inevitably get tied up with politics. And on no account do we believe that religion should be mixed with politics in any sense. So I hope that answers your question. But basically, I mean, what Nichiren Daishonin taught and what we're doing is based on the belief that war arises from the hearts of men and women, and that the only way you'll ever stop war is by changing those inherent evil influences that exist in every human being. Okay. All right? Great. Okay, it's 9 o'clock, so we ought to stop. Thank you very much for listening patiently. Many thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.